Welcome to the Science of Beers podcast with me, Mick McGee. I love having proper conversations with intelligent people, especially over a beer, and that's exactly what this podcast is. We'll cover a new topic each week, so join us with a beer and let's cheers to science. Our guest this week, Emily Hogg, is an associate professor at the Department for the Study of Culture at the University of Southern Denmark. Hope you enjoy.
So I'm from the UK, I'm from England, from the southeast of England, which is where I grew up, and then I studied English at Nottingham University, and then I did a PhD, and well, first of all I did a master's degree that was about human rights, and then which was a social sciences master's, and then I started to think that I missed studying literature, but I wanted to kind of bring the literature stuff that I was interested in together with issues of more social, political relevance, and so that's why I decided to do a PhD that was about the way that literary texts reflect on or interact with issues connected with human rights. So the way that literature deals with human rights issues, with ideas around human rights abuses, and the underlying ideas in human rights discourse. So I did that. Then I just saw an advert for a job here in Denmark that was in a project called Uses of Literature, which is about how we can bring literature more into dialogue with the social world, and often literature people have often said that using literature is a bit reductive, but we want to try and find ways that we can think about literature in a better way, broader way.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Cheers, Emily.
Cheers. Thank you.
Because this is so foreign to me, and what I'm used to after 6 years of biology, I'm fascinated by the methods that people would use to study literature. You know.
Yeah, it's very difficult to prove how literature affects people, partly because different readers can respond to things in different ways, partly because often in literature studies we've been a bit resistant to more quantitative methods, so we don't tend to like doing big studies about what did you actually think of this book. We tend to just kind of assume.
Yeah.
In my own research, what I try to do is look at the works that I'm reading, try and interpret how they work as pieces of art, and then try to make arguments that seem logical or consistent about how the aspects of the literature, how aspects of the way the texts are written might be likely to affect readers. So for example, if one of the novels that I've written about recently has this kind of circular structure where it ends in the same place that it begins, and so then so it ends with a scene that's very similar to the scene that starts the novel in the first place. Yeah. And so then I try to say, well, what effect does that have? What is that likely to do to a reader who reads it? And how could we use that circular structure to think about what effect it might have to somebody who's reading it?
Which novel are we talking about here?
So this is a novel called Paradise by A.L. Kennedy, and it's about an alcoholic narrator. And what I was arguing when I wrote about that novel was that there are lots of very formulaic stories about being an alcoholic and what that is like. Lots of very established stories, cultural narratives that we tell about female alcoholism. And one of those is that it's a kind of endless downward spiral that you're going to end up. And the narrator in the novel talks about this. She talks about the fact that everyone expects that one day she's going to end up lonely, and then dying alone in her flat, and no one's going to find the body for days. And so there's a kind of culturally established story about what it's like to be a female alcoholic, and
like assumptions, prejudices.
Yeah, like stereotypes. Yeah. And then in the novel, it's not as if it's a happy story. It isn't. But the fact that it ends in the same place that it begins, that it has this circular structure. What I suggest about that is that it's a kind of, it's a way of resisting that cultural stereotype that things only end in one way, because it ends back at the beginning and it kind of sends her round again in this spiral. And that could be a bad thing because it's like she never gets out of the place she's stuck in. But it's also possibly a more positive story because it's about the way that the ending that we often presuppose for female alcoholics, this kind of desperate, lonely ending, might not be the only ending of the story. It might be possible to tell the story of female alcoholism in a different type of way.
Yeah, but where does that prejudice come from?
I think from a number of different places. I think that culture has a big part to play in spreading those kinds of stories in the first place. So TV, films, there are lots of cliches that we see that get repeated, and novels too. Part of what I argue in that essay is that there's a very established story about alcoholism that comes in part from recovery movements and the types of stories that they tell about alcoholism, which aren't wrong, but just that they've taken on a kind of overwhelming cultural power that they just get repeated again and again. And there are also lots of established stories, especially in a British context, that come from the temperance movement, and this is a very well established historical issue that temperance movements kind of set up a very formulaic narrative about what it was to be an alcoholic, and even though that was obviously a long time ago, a lot of ideas about alcoholism persist through time.
So for a podcast called Science and Beers, this is particularly interesting. The podcast was named Science and Beers because that beers part, first of all, we do drink beers and we talk science, but also the beers part implies for me a kind of relaxedness to it. So it's accessible. Oh, you're talking about it over a pint.
Yeah.
It must be, easy to get.
Yeah.
I hope it is.
Yeah.
You're looking at female characters in literature specifically, and is there a difference in the literature between female characters and male characters, and the kind of standard narrative there, if there is one?
Yeah, that's something that the narrator Hannah in this novel Paradise talks about, that there's often seen to be something slightly more pathetic about female drinkers, heavy drinkers, than male, partly because she suggests there's something that links that men drinking is seen as sort of natural and masculine, whereas women drinking too much seems to conflict with ideas of femininity as kind of controlled and quote-unquote pure and nice and appealing. But I think that one of the interesting things about alcohol, which connects with what you were saying about science and beers, is that it has so many uses in our societies, and it has so many different meanings because of that. So it's a normal part of daily life for many, many people, that it's a way of relaxing after work. It's something you do to celebrate. It's something you do for fun, and it's also a way of trying to get away from the everyday. It's a kind of transcendence almost, because it makes you feel differently than you do normally. And then, of course, there are all of these aspects of danger and risk that are associated with drinking. When we read articles in the paper about drinking, it's often about the health risk. We're putting ourselves at risk socially because we're all drinking too much. So there are all of these different aspects of alcohol, but because it's so ordinary, because it's around us so much, often we don't look at those or think about those.
Is it possible that it's because in books and novels and in the movies and in art, it's okay to people talk about alcohol as a way to convey a message, as a way to convey conviviality, a way that we're using in Science and Beers to convey our relaxedness, or to convey the characters of a female character in a book?
Definitely, I think that art and films, TV, books can all play a role in creating and strengthening these cultural associations we have with particular substances. And so what alcohol or any drug is not just the physical effects it has on the body or on the mind, but also the series of associations that we have with it, the ideas that we have about it. And those are created through the culture that we experience. Like I was thinking when you were talking then about Sex and the City and the way that they kind of, or at least it seemed this way when I was younger, that they kind of popularised cocktails and it made it seem like a sort of female
cosmopolitan
fun. Yeah,
specifically.
exactly, yeah. And that was how to be sort of an independent woman doing her own thing, drinking with her friends. And the drinking was an integral part of what the show was presenting as an aspirational lifestyle, which isn't to say that it's necessarily a bad thing or a thing that we ought to stop doing, but I think it's interesting to think about how our perspectives on alcohol as much as on other drugs are created in part through these kind of representations.
Yeah. There was another book you were basing your argument on there about female characters and alcohol.
Yeah.
Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so that's a novel called So Happy It Hurts by Annalisa McIntosh, and that's a very recent novel and a really interesting one in terms of the way that it's structured as a piece of art, because it's about a main character who decides to stop drinking, and the book is structured as it's kind of a book in a book. It's structured as if it were the notes and things that she writes into a book that she's stolen from the hospital that she works at, which is one of those kind of slightly cliched self-help books called The Little Book of Happy, which has sort of little phrases in saying ways of being happy. It's a kind of advice-giving book about happiness, and she takes this book from the hospital she works at and she starts to write in the margins of this book and around the edges, and she starts to stick stuff into the book, and so the novel is presented as her notes on another book. So it has a kind of interesting structure, and in the way that it's structured, it is a way of suggesting a kind of interaction with some of the self-helpy ideas that are out there about what it means to be happy. So she includes them, but she's also kind of writing around them and writing back to them and critiquing them and adding to them. So it has a structure of like a kind of conversation between her voice and the voice of this self-help narrative.
What would be your analysis then of the impact in that book for the reader?
So I think that it picks up something that's very recognisable in our culture. So those little books, they were very popular in airports. I don't know, they probably still are. Like a few years ago, those books that kind of tell you this is how to live a good life, and it's very short quotes from various famous people, some of them spurious quotes, and it takes something that we're familiar with, that is out there, that we know about, and it shows how that can be used and thought about in a new way. And in part, I think the novel is trying to critique or question some of the ideas we have around contemporary ideas about happiness, about what it means to be happy, and whether happiness is the goal of life, and whether giving up drinking, for example, is a way of attaining happiness, whether that is what happiness is, or whether programs of self-improvement in a broader sense are where we should be directing our energy. And so the novel doesn't necessarily come to a conclusion, but it shows how narratives of self-improvement and the idea, maybe the slightly banal generalization about we should all be pursuing the maximum amount of happiness at all times. It shows how that idea can be tested or pushed or discussed, debated. That it doesn't necessarily need to be taken at face value. It can be kind of questioned.
I'm happy having a pint in the sun,
yeah.
but if I pursued that too much.
Yeah.
So talking about that those happiness books, it just made me think about. So we're influenced every day by the actual characters in our lives.
Yeah.
So talking to people, just hearing other people's stories, that affects our view of reality, and it affects our own behaviour.
Yeah.
It kind of sets the rules for how we live.
Yeah.
And that can be... I'm talking about how people treat people. I'm talking about left, right, liberal, conservative, or sexist, racist views that can also be promoted through the people that we meet. But the beautiful thing about books is that you can really get into a character. Not only can you get into a character, you can get into the minds of the character. Yeah. So you can really feel for whatever the author decided for that character is going to be, and you can warm to that person, or you can be distracted from that person. Yeah. But it's essentially what a beautiful novel is, an actual character. So is it possible that these fictitious characters can have such an influence on our own behaviour as a real life person? Do you think?
I maybe wouldn't measure it, but I think that that there's definitely the possibility that reading, and as you say, the extent to which reading gives us the sense of knowing what it's like to be somebody else or seeing the world through somebody else's eyes, can be profoundly influential. It's funny you should mention this because I've been doing oral exams, as you know, and one of the issues we've been talking about is whether literature can help you to understand what it's like to be someone who's very different from you, whether it can help you to kind of bridge the gap between your own experiences and experiences of other people. And there's a philosopher, Martha Nussbaum, who we've been reading in this class, and she talks about the fact that when we read, we have to exercise our imagination. We have to imagine what it would be like to be in certain situations that might be very remote from our own lives and experiences. And she says that by doing that, we can come to have a better understanding of what life is like for others. And I think that makes a lot of sense. There's also another philosopher that we've been talking about in this class, Derek Attridge, or he's a literary critic, and he talks about the way that when we read literature, one of the things that we ought to do is to treat it, not try to make it so that we understand everything about it, but then when we come to a piece of literature, especially pieces of literature that are surprising or unusual or weird in the way that they're constructed, or seem a bit alienating in the way that a lot of artistic experimental writing can be alienating or strange, when we come to texts like that, we can respond to them by allowing them to be what they are, to be confusing, to be strange and be weird. And if we allow them to be weird in that way, then that's a way of practicing responding ethically to other people, because often when we meet others, we might not know what they're going through. We might not be able to fully understand the experience of people who are very different from us. But if we can allow that difference without feeling threatened by it, then that can be a way of dealing ethically with other people. And he says that we can practice that if we read.
You're delving into feminism as well, aren't you?
So one of the things on a practical level is that my colleague Ella Feggetts and I set up a feminist network for academics in the humanities faculty at SDU, and the idea of that is to bring together people working on feminist issues, both in research and also in teaching, and try and connect researchers on those issues and provide support for each other, and then also do readings on feminist issues, and then think about strategies for bringing about more equality in the places that we teach and research. So that's a kind of practical strategy. On a research level, I've been working a lot on writing that deals with feminist issues, or literary writing that tries to represent issues that are relevant to feminist causes. So I recently wrote a chapter for a new book called New Feminist Studies, which is about how literature can articulate a feminist perspective on migration. So I looked at a non-fiction text and some prose poems, and I talked about how they present migration and how they show that migration can be really dangerous, that particularly for women it can be the source of gender-based violence, especially for people migrating from poorer countries to richer ones, experiencing dangerous migrations, as we see recently in the people coming to Europe, and how literature shows those dangers and difficulties, but how literature can also show how important mobility and flexibility and the movement of people is, that it kind of defends the value and the importance of being able to move between locations and countries, how it articulates this kind of complicated perspective on migration, and how that is a feminist point, because it's about breaking down the barriers or the boundaries that we often see between people, between certain groups, between certain countries and others. So there's a feminist writer called Chandra Mahanti, and she talks about the fact that feminism should be about trying to cross borders and to break down the borders that are both the physical borders between richer countries and poorer ones, but also the borders that separate men and women, or the borders that separate certain groups of women from each other. So trying to think about perspectives that are more fluid and open.
I'm reminded of a play I watched just on just a few days ago called Small Island.
Yes.
Wow, the National Theatre was doing that.
Yes, I haven't seen the performance, but yeah.
And it's based on a book.
Yes.
But wow, that was a good 3 hours, female-led, about emigration from Jamaica to England just after the war. And my God, it crossed a few borders, I'll tell you.
Yeah.
It was one of the most powerful plays I've ever saw.
Oh, that's great. So, yeah, I'll have to watch the play version.
Yeah. And if I believe I genuinely believe the world would be a better place if everybody saw that play.
Definitely. I mean, I think that's so important right now in Britain. I signed a petition the other day about the Windrush generation who are seeking compensation for the scandal in which many of them were threatened with deportation, or were deported or put in immigration centres, and only 5% have received any compensation from the British government. And I think that there are still so many issues that stem in British society from that period of time, and so little acknowledgement of the contribution that immigrants have made to Britain, that I think that artwork is so important in trying to make visible what is often ignored.
Whenever you're talking about the importance of art to change minds, or at least influence minds, say it was a feminist book, the person who's going to buy that is most likely already going to agree with the points that are going to be raised in the book, and the person who's going to go to a play like Small Island is probably going to be agreeing with the themes that are talked about in that book. So that's a difficult one.
Yeah, it really is.
So people consume the art that supports their own views.
But I think probably it's human nature that we tend to gravitate towards those things that feel familiar to us. And so if we agree with an issue, we're more likely to seek out art that responds and reflects that. So I think that that's probably an issue of institutions like publishers and broadcasters, national broadcasters, in trying to, as much as possible, push things that can open up different perspectives. So like the BBC or whatever they put on TV, that has a big audience, so that can reach out. And the same with what is published, what is put on prize shortlists, or what's in the front window of bookshops. That is important in terms of providing options that at least, you might get somebody who just goes into a bookshop and says, oh, that looks okay, I'll pick that up. So if the choice is out there, I think that's really important. But I think it is a matter of institutions supporting more diverse voices.
I personally am not aware at the moment of any kind of like popular novel or whatever that would be, say, pushing, I'm sure they exist, but say pushing ideology that I personally would find unhelpful to society, such as racist or anti-feminist narratives? Are they out there? Are you aware of?
I think that there's a lot of harmful ideas that can be perpetuated by cliched ideas about masculinity or femininity, for
James
example.
Bond.
James Bond
For
is
example.
a good example,
Yeah.
yeah, exactly, yeah. And all the debate around, James Bond could never be played by a black actor. I think that whole debate shows a lot of unfortunate ideas that people have about race and about identity, that so it might not be an example of straightforward racism, but there's still a lot of racism that's around the ideas of who is allowed to play this cultural icon, I think.
There is talk about bringing in a female character to play.
Yeah.
Not James Bond, but...
Yeah, change the
Janet,
name,
maybe.
yeah. Yeah. Oh, here comes our drinks. Thank you.
Here's our drinks. Thank you very much. Excellent. Cheers.
Cheers. Thank you. So yeah, my colleague Peter Simmons and I edited this collection, which is called Precarity in Contemporary Literature and Culture.
Precarity. So precarity is like low economic status.
Yeah, or I guess it's the way that, especially today, it feels to some people that a sense of insecurity has become more prevalent across society. So if there used to be, like we were talking about with secure work, there used to be more of an expectation, especially in, for example, the UK and the US, there used to be more of an expectation that you could get a job and then you could stay in that job for the rest of your life, and it would be fairly reliable, and maybe you wouldn't really love your job or find loads of self-fulfillment in it, but it would be there for you and you could make your regular wage. Whereas today there are lots of changes in the economy which seem to make it so that regular work is harder to come by. And there's a sense of insecurity that is related partly to that, but then also to broader social issues. For example, the threat of climate change, which creates this sense that, you know, maybe we're heading towards this disaster. So precarity, I would say, is a word for a contemporary feeling of insecurity and vulnerability and not being sure about the future that some people say is heightened today.
Well, I think it's only exacerbated by the fact that the virus came along and just took the whole world out by its knees.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and that's such a good example of the way that we like to pretend. I think it's probably a human thing to pretend that we are that we're in control to some extent of our lives. And I think that one of the things the virus has shown us is how quickly normality can be undermined. And there's, we are vulnerable as a species. We're vulnerable to so many things. And this has been a really clear example of that human vulnerability.
So you're looking at precarity combined with the use of alcohol in literature.
So my own stuff is about that, but then I also have this book that's coming out with Bloomsbury that I co-edited with my colleague, that's about the way that literature, but also culture and visual art and theatre and films represent precarity in general. So we've got some really interesting chapters in that book about how, for example, Hollywood films or performance art can kind of reflect on the experience of precarity. There's an interesting chapter about speculative fiction and how that might be a way of encouraging us to imagine more solidarity between different people who find themselves feeling precarious or unstable. That's by Brian Yazell, and I think it's interesting to think about the way that different cultural forms or different types of culture can provide insight into insecurity and instability and help us to think about it in different ways.
Mm-hmm. So are you saying that art is just nodding towards this precarity in our existence, or do you see it as having an influence on how we perceive the situations that we're in?
Yeah, so I think that would be one of the arguments, that we can see literature, of course, as reflecting that situation, but maybe also it can change the way we approach it. So, for example, it might help us to critique the situation that we're in, or it might also help us to think differently about, for example, can we cope with insecurity? Like, if we find ourselves in a situation that is uncertain for us, sometimes that can provoke a sense of fear and anxiety, but could that also encourage us to be more empathetic towards others, perhaps those who have always, or because of their identities, have always faced heightened insecurity? So can literature change the way we think about the circumstances we face? The philosopher Judith Butler says that sometimes if we encounter our own vulnerability, it might make us more able to think about the social structures that can help prevent or help to protect against vulnerability that's heightened too far. So help to put in place social security nets that can protect the most vulnerable. Obviously, when we experience our own vulnerability, it can make us not respond that way. It can make us angry and violent, but one of the things it might be able to do is make us pay more attention to the things that are necessary in society for people's lives to be protected more.
Mm-hmm. I'm reminded of John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath. Mm-hmm. I happened to read that just as the Syrian crisis was reaching a peak, and there was lots of immigration to Europe, and there wasn't a lot of welcome. And I'm reading that book that was written 50 years ago, set 100 years ago, and I saw a lot of recurring themes in there, as if, you have a lot of sympathy and empathy for the Waite family. Yeah. If you read that book, but that book clearly hasn't had that very well read and widespread book. Doesn't seem to have had that much of an impact in society, because look at the world today. So books important, like books that are taught in schools can have very strong messages, but I'm not saying books don't have the ability to change the world, but I'm saying that it's heartbreaking to see that important messages that are conveyed through art aren't received and learned from.
Definitely, yeah. And I think that we have to be realistic and also think about it's not just a kind of linear process. It's often tempting to think that the future is always going to be an improvement, but actually we see all the time that there are lots of people and structures in society that have things to gain from oppressing migrants, or from building walls, or from encouraging division. So there's always going to be a need to kind of keep articulating the points that are articulated, for example, by Steinbeck. Yeah.
So should we have everybody read The Grapes of Wrath, or or just listen to the Bruce Springsteen song that describes the same book?
Yeah.
What are you reading at the moment?
I'm reading a book called Blonde by Joyce Carol Oates, which is a fictionalized novel about Marilyn Monroe, and the writer used the facts about Monroe's life and used the documents that are available, the letters, etc., and has created this portrait of what it might have been like to be Marilyn Monroe from her childhood to her death. And
from her perspective, she's the writer. She's the narrator.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so it's from her perspective, and so we get an imagined idea of what it would be like to be in her mind. I'm reading the part about her childhood right now. This kind of very vulnerable and difficult childhood, what that might have been like, how that shaped her personality. And I think it's a very interesting imaginative exercise to try and work out what it might have been like to be her. And it's really really well done and compelling. And it's interesting because Marilyn Monroe is obviously someone we see from the outside. What we know about her is her performance and her look and her charisma, and so it's interesting to get a sense of how it might have been to be her, or to feel like a sense of her thoughts or perspective. It's a very interesting idea.
Emily, thanks very much for talking to me on the Science for Years podcast. Cheers. Well, I hope you enjoyed that podcast. If you want to get in touch with Emily or keep up to date with her research, you can find her Twitter tag in the description of this episode. Also, please consider becoming a patron of this podcast so we can continue. You can do that at patreon.com/Science and Beers. Thanks for listening.